themselves and to state their preferred gender pronouns if they have them.
Hello, my name is Brett and I have no preference.
Hi, my name is Dylan, and he, him is fine.
I'm Amy Dingley Jones, and she and her is fine.
Okay, thanks to the panel. I'd also like all of the speakers to introduce themselves and their preferred gender pronouns, as well as one member of the team just writing in the chat your name and speaking order, so we have your full names also written down in the chat.
Hi, I'm Diana. I'm the first speaker of Proposition, Team Romania, and the preferred pronoun is her.
Hi, I'm Theodor, the second speaker of Team Romania. Whatever makes you feel most comfortable. When it comes to pronouns, don't really have any specific preference.
I'm Valerio, third speaker for Proposition. I prefer he or they.
Thanks to the proposition. And okay, we also have for the reply. And can the opposition also introduce themselves so we check your mics?
Hi, my name is Maria Gomberg. I think I'm registered in TappyCat as Alexandra Maria Gomberg. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I'm first up.
Hello, my name is Manuel. I am second in reply. And my preferred pronouns are he, him, but I really don't mind.
Hello, my name is Mariana Icasa. I'm the third opposition speaker, and my preferred pronouns are she, her. There's two girls with the same name on the team. I'm Mariana Icasa, so the one whose last name starts with an I. Sorry for clarifying, it's just we've had a lot of issues with that in previous tournaments.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, thanks to everyone. Just give me a second to screen share the stopwatch and we can begin. Okay.
Oh, just really quickly, can Team Romania please say how they prefer POIs to be given?
Yeah, sure.
We prefer audibly.
Same here.
Same here, yeah, for everyone. What about you?
Same goes for us.
Okay, amazing. Does everyone see the stopwatch I'm sharing right now? Okay, then without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to begin the case for the government side. Hear, hear.
Can everybody hear me? Great. In 2013, in Bangladesh, Rana Plaza, a subcontractor of H&M and Inditex, basically killed 1,000 people. How does that happen? Simply because workers, they are told numerous times that there were problems with the safety measures right there, that a building can actually come into pieces specifically because there were no regulation there. But nobody listened to them, right? Because they needed to have lower prices for H&M or for Inditex, right? 1,000 girls and women died, and other hundreds of people had their arms and legs amputated. Simply because multinational companies like Apple, Inditex, and H&M, which have their headquarters in US and in other Western countries, they have their supply chains, basically the things of raw material, right? To actually extract those raw materials or to sew the clothes, specifically in other countries, through having contracts with them and having some contracts in those countries to have lower prices, right? We believe that they go to countries in Africa, for example, or in other countries. Note that it's very important that this is only a legal delimitation. We believe that the supply chain is also part of the company and they're still part of the business. So solely because the geography separates them, that does not mean that they're not part of the company. Moreover than that, we're telling you that in those countries, a lot of high abuses happen specifically because the legislation permits so to do so, basically. You have have child labor abuses, right? How Mac and L'Oreal basically in Kenya have a subcontract that put kids to actually go into mines and have the shiny gilters for the makeup industry, and basically those kids die in those mines. Or you have people working 16 hours a day for $1, like in Bangladesh, or in inhumane positions, right? Like Amazon, what they did do, basically, they force their employees to pee in a bottle just because to have more time to actually give more profit to that company. We're telling that in those subcontracts specifically don't have safety measures. Note panel, this is systematic. It's a standard practice for multinational companies. Every multinational, or the majority of them, do that, and we believe that they should be legally answerable. How precisely they're going to be legally answerable? We believe that this is going to materialize in government agencies across the Western world, where the most multinations have their headquarters, and basically are going to have agencies tasked with analyzing allegations of human rights abuses in the supply chains of those multinational companies. And they're going to impose a lot of fines if this is going to happen. And this is similarly to what European Commission do in the moment in which they put fines on the multinational companies that actually do tax evasion within the European Union, specifically what they did with fining Google in 2018. Note, the fines are going to be gradually higher in the moment in which you're going to have new abuses. We believe that this should happen specifically for three major reasons. Firstly, basically, because companies are directly responsible for the connection to every human rights abuses. Secondly, how we basically reduce the human rights abuses to happen where they happen around the globe. And my second speaker is going to talk about how we actually improve the work conditions in the developing world. Before going to my first argument about how companies are directly responsible for any connection to the human rights abuses, if you have any POI.
Quick question. Why are the laws in, for example, Bangladesh, India, or Mexico and China so permissible? What is the incentive for governments to make these laws so that these companies can exploit in these countries?
If they want to suggest that the problem is the subcontractors, our argument is going to actually tell you why specifically companies have a responsibility to that. So let's get on to it. So we believe that human rights are universally agreed that being the most important thing our societies have across the globe to actually obtain. Because the life of somebody, the quality of life of somebody is what dictates everything within our society. And basically in the moment in which multinational companies, they actually concede to actually stay in this life and put it into jeopardy, that's the moment in which they need to be held responsible. Why do companies have a responsibility? For two major reasons. Firstly, because they're a direct accomplice in the human rights abuses. Panel, they know that Bangladesh, countries in Asia and in Africa have very low target when it comes to actually sustaining human rights things. They know that the legislation right there is doing it. That's precisely why they go there in the first scenario, specifically because if they wanted to have other subcontracts, if they had other options, they would have remained in US, and moreover than that, they pay those companies that actually have human rights abuses, right? They know from the get-go that in the moment in which that subcontract actually doesn't ask for a lot of money, they need to cut that money from other parts, for example, actually giving proper wages to their workers and so on. But secondly, we're telling you that the companies could have prevented this from the get-go. Firstly, they could have engaged and had other companies, good companies that actually maintain rights of the individuals in the US, for example. Instead of having H&M sewing their clothes in Bangladesh, they could have had it in US. Moreover than that, we're telling that they did this specifically to have a competitive advantage, right? They do it for profit because they know that in the moment in which you're going to actually pay those people less, you can actually target your products with less money, and those people are going to actually buy it more. We believe that all of these two criteria actually address the fact that they need to be held responsible. No, thank you. We believe that they should not be morally accountable. Let's say why a company should not be morally accountable. Firstly, if they weren't aware of this, but I already explained to you how they were very, very aware because they collaborated with those people. Secondly, if they weren't in control with that, none of it, right? They were in control from the get-go. So basically what happens here is that basically they had money stained with their blood, specifically because they were able to actually jeopardize the human life just so they could make profit. Principally, we believe that they need to be held accountable for this part. Now, my second argument about how we basically
Before that-
reduce the human rights abuses, no thank you, made within companies. So we're telling you that in the moment in which you have a lot of multinational companies, what happens is a race to the bottom. Why is that? Two mechanisms here. Firstly, because for every single company, the major goal is profit, right? But the problem here is that the multinational companies actually are in another league, right? They right now cannot compete for the quality of
POI.
clothes and so on. No, thank you. Specifically because a lot of other multi-companies are basically at the same quality as they. For example, Nike and Adidas. Thus, in order to actually be profitable, you need to compete on another level. Why is that? What that other level is? That other level is price. So basically what they do in order to actually remain gigantic and have basically a lot of products sold is to drag down the standards and engage in this race to the bottom and actually sacrifice the human rights of people and go to those countries where it's much, much, much cheaper to actually have those products. So basically this is what happens. What happens on our side? We curb this because we affect them where it matters the most, right? Because you're going to have a lot of fines and significantly higher if you're going to actually engage in that. But secondly, because publicly right now the public is going to hold you accountable, this is going to actually make it worse for companies to actually engage in this human rights issues. They will not basically have contractors from those countries which are not actually respecting human rights, but others who are actually good. So basically we dictate the way in which the behavior of companies engage in the larger scale. So panel, because we don't want profit stained with blood, vote proposition.
I thank the first speaker of the proposition and invite the first opposition speaker to begin the case for the opposition side. Hear, hear.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So I'll just count myself down. 3, 2, 1. This debate is what should not be the average worker. This debate is about the people who live in countries that have systematically failed them. It's about starving workers and the middlemen in the process of putting food on your table. This debate is about characterizing how the supply chain works and explaining to you how multinational companies are not the only ones who should be held accountable for human rights abuses. Not only that, but many times they're unaware even of the people that are working for them. In this debate, the other side of the house not only didn't give you sufficient characterization of what their side looks like, but they didn't give you sufficient characterization of the status quo on refutation and our own case. First of all, whenever they talk about the characterization of the supply chain, they try to talk about the idea that whenever Amazon is hiring a worker and giving them no opportunity to go to the bathroom, this falls within the framework of this debate. Let's make something very clear. The supply chain is everything from the truck driver that brings the fruits and vegetables to Unilever so they make yogurt, to the people who service textile industries by making textile in the first place. Many times, these are just people who fall under the contractual agreement, and the workers don't even know that they're servicing Amazon, that they're servicing the multinational companies. This is particularly important whenever they talk about their mechanization. They talk about three things. First of all, on fines, that they're going to just fine the companies within these Western countries that are doing some sort of harm. First of all, we believe that fines are not enough of an incentive for multinational corporations that just pay them off and they still are able to keep their costs down. Additionally, we tell you that these multinational companies don't only operate in the West, and us having Western institutions, Western laws go through osmosis into the third world is problematic. There are two arguments. The first one is where they talk about how these companies are direct accomplices. The second one was about about smaller companies. So let's talk about the direct accomplice argument. We tell you that the first things first is that the legislation within the companies, within the countries that you're characterizing stays the same. This means that you can still contract cheap labor even if you have to pay an exorbitant fine. This is still more likely to be beneficial. Additionally, we tell you that these factories don't only serve the supply chain of large companies. They still have national production. They're the ones that should be held accountable. The governments that permit these operations. This is what should happen on their side. Their second argument is about how smaller companies just basically are likely not to have to compete on prices. We tell you this falls out of the debate. They're not going to be fined. Now on our burden, we tell you that this debate is about whose responsibility are these issues and who is more likely to have more efficient and effective accountability. The counterfactual on our side of the house is more internal regulation. We talk to you about holding companies accountable for the parts of the process that they have something to do with. If Nestle sends the direct request in order to dump trash in villages, they should be the ones that are held accountable. We tell you that the enforcement should be with local authorities and through local laws. This is why our first argument is an accountability. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
But here I was thinking that you are saying that these governments are incapable, that they don't have the legislation. Why do you trust them to do the enforcement for these little parts of the supply chain?
We understand your point, but the thing is that we believe that having contextual law is always going to be more beneficial than just bringing in foreign law that is not contextual to the premises of these companies. That's my second argument. But broadly, there are two types of multinational corporations in our first. First of all, we tell you that they operate firstly in a range of 2 to 3 countries, and they have a lower margin of profits and overall hold less power in society. In principle, the only way for these companies to enter an extremely competitive market is to lower their cost of production to a similar degree as everyone else. This is for the fast fashion industry, who only want to make a profit when the market price is so low that they lose the cost of production. Secondly, we don't think that these companies necessarily consent to the inherent practices of the industry whenever they try to compete. Second, on the practical side, you could force them out of the market entirely, which leads to job loss and affects the average citizen. If that doesn't happen, then these are the new incentive to produce locally. Even if their costs rise, at least they aren't hurt by the political and mediatic hit of being legally charged. You lose jobs in the developing world where people often just don't have an alternative. Secondly, we talk about companies that operate across the entire continent, producing vastly in multiple countries in the developing world, who hoard disproportionate power in society. They're basically structural reasons where they are likely to be held accountable. First of all, they have a strong relationship with the government through mechanisms such as lobbying, political gain, political capital, and allowing these companies to operate in the first place. Where these companies lead to in the countries through the creation of jobs and the increase in production and general GDP growth. It also improves the image of these politicians. Secondly, a presence over the significant proportion of the world makes it legally complicated for legal prosecution to occur in the first place. Legal courts with developing countries where the human rights violations occur don't have the infrastructure to go against the legal power of these companies, so the companies are likely not to be sued sufficiently in the first place. This looks like American Eagle being trialed in Vietnam and not being held accountable whatsoever. These bureaucratic obstacles that the companies face are basically bring that the countries are prosecuted and are contingent on the abuse which happens and where the headquarters lie. Either way, you run the risk of infringing on the sovereignty and jurisdiction of the country. It's easy for these companies to evade prosecution based on legal technicalities and location. What then is likely scenario for the super powerful companies? They have incentive to be even less transparent with their production processes just to hide away and not have to pay these fines. Proposition's principal stance is contingent on practical outcomes to actual retribution to people that are harmed. This does not happen on their side of the house. Our second argument is about better accountability, how this changes on our side of the house. We tell you that the centralization of legal accountability lets actors who have direct effect over the process go scot-free. Governments and the smaller companies alike have a role in human rights violations that they have no incentive to change, where the ones being trialed are the ones ones that are higher. In Southeast Asia, the government gave fiat to the military to attack protesters that required higher wages for textile companies. The government in Latin America literally let farmers die in the hands of the narco. Practically, those who are directly to blame should be the ones who are prosecuted. The managers who beat their workers, the small textile firm that spills their ink into the water. These companies have no incentive to change their practices, especially for local productions, which works alongside larger multinational. It additionally shifts the view and the focus of actors who are truly to blame. Beyond the practical, let's talk about principle. Historically, these companies have been giving fiat by corrupt governments that are the ones with a moral obligation towards their people. If these national governments who have the contextual knowledge and obligation to service those who have been shown in the media are the ones to blame, they are the ones that have failed these people in the past. They're the ones who have to create better. But additionally, on efficiency, the centralization of legal accountability, even in the best of cases where prop can justify it, is dramatically inefficient. Having trust in the legal terms of one large company to tackle the company issues of smaller ones means that the change is slow. The changes, even if this change does happen, this is a cost to the people that are suffering a great injustice. They have no time to wait. Waiting is not an option. When we target issue locally, the wait shortens.
I thank the first opposition speaker and invite the second speaker of the proposition. Hear, hear. One second, please. Just 1 second, please. I need to close my window. It started to rain.
It's fine.
Thank you. Okay, I invite the second speaker of the proposition.
Can you hear me if I speak like this? Is it fine? Okay, 1 sec. Across the world, multinational corporations that are part of the textile industry are subcontracting local companies in countries where child labor is legal in order for them to be able to pick the cotton off of cotton fields just because they have smaller hands and have a lower likelihood of actually ruining the cotton from which clothes are created. Panel, we're not talking here about contextualized legislation. We're talking about the fundamental rights for people to be able to work in a decent environment, to not risk enormous dangers brought to their security, to their bodily integrity, to allow children to have a basic childhood. We don't think that we're talking here about the sorts of things that team opposition can't just like brush off as smaller differences in regional legislation. No, we're talking about countries which on team opposition's portrayal have failed the fundamental duty to protect their citizens. We have to do something to ensure that these citizens are protected if those countries aren't doing it themselves. No, thank you. Okay, 4 main points in my speech. First, a bit on our model and why team opposition challenges to it aren't actually that valid. Secondly, on the principle. Thirdly, on the practicalities. And fourthly, my own substantive about how the policy incentivizes an improvement in working conditions across the board in the developing world. Just one more clarification before anything else. Most of team opposition's challenges so far are just whataboutisms. They tell us, oh, but we should punish instead the subcontractors themselves. No, thank you. The ones who are directly carrying out these human rights abuses. We totally stand for punishing them as well. The question is, how are we doing it? Because on your side of the house and on ours as well, right? Because now we're not like fundamentally changing the incentive structures for these states. On your side of the house, you don't have any way in which to ensure that these governments really are going to care about their citizens in the developing world, that they really are going to actually stop these abuses in the first place. You have no clear mechanism, whereas on our side of the house, we do have one. Okay, let's first talk about their challenges to our model. Two things here. They first tell us that fines don't work. And look, we're not talking about like a couple of $100s in fines. We're talking about substantial fines, millions of dollars if necessary, and repeated fines if a company continues to breach the law. We think that when they can easily get out of paying these fines by just telling their subcontractors, guys, please stop hiring children. Please at least ensure that the building in which your workers are working is a safe one and it is not going to collapse on them. We think that comparatively, they're probably going to just do better if they just follow this sorts of legislation and if they avoid the sorts of the sorts of human rights abuses in their production chains. Secondly, they tell us, oh, but these developing countries have bad judicial systems. Yeah, we're prosecuting these companies in functional judicial systems in Western countries. We've already explained that. You should have listened to our model. Before I go on, sure.
First prop concedes that the most likely scenario is that these countries just leave Bangladesh, Indonesia, for example. What is more likely to happen in a local country, so like in a local government in Bangladesh, for laws to be strengthened?
Okay, so we think in some very marginal cases that may happen, but in the vast majority of cases, it's still so much cheaper to do all of your production within these developing countries. For example, you can't move mines when the natural resources are in developing countries. Secondly, the general costs of living and the general salary that you need to pay a worker in order for them to have a decent life is just much smaller in developing countries. It's still better for these companies to stay. Okay, let's talk a bit about the principle. They essentially their only big challenge on here is that, oh, MNCs don't know about the sorts of abuses going on in their supply chain. Well, if you ask us, they should know. They have the opportunity to inspect everything that their subcontractors are doing before they even end up signing that contract with them. If they don't do that, that's because they just want to they just want to be blind to the abuses that are happening and then act surprised when someone is revealing them. So we think that they have all the capacity and all the chances to investigate these things and to prevent human rights abuses. No, thank you. To prevent sponsoring essentially human rights abuses through these subcontractors. Then they tell us that our principle is contingent on pragmatics. Guys, we told you that we have to hold those who are funneling money into human rights abuses accountable. No matter what the practical consequences are, we still have a duty to hold them accountable. We still win on principle. Secondly, on the practicalities, and just it's one big contention that they have here, that there's going to be less transparency from corporations on our side of the house. Look, corporations are already trying to hide the abuses that are happening in the developing world, and it's failing massively. That's because you have local networks of of activists, of journalists, of NGOs who are actively investigating this. You have major news publications in the West who are investigating what's happening in the supply chain of major MNCs. The thing is, you're going to have an even bigger incentive as a journalist to carry out these sorts of investigations, because you know that if you can prove a human rights abuse is happening in the supply chain of one of these corporations on our side of the house, you know that they're going to get fined. You have a real chance to stop these abusive practices. We actually do that better on our side of the house. Okay, let's now go into my own substantive about how this policy is likely to incentivize an improvement, no thank you, in working conditions across the board in the developing world. So in the status quo, there's a race to the bottom, meaning that all local companies seeking to be subcontracted by MNCs in the developing world are seeking to lower their costs of production, because that's what MNCs are looking for, the cheapest of subcontractors. So more and more human rights abuses occur, lower and lower pay, more and more hours that these workers have to work. Okay, we change this through three distinct avenues. First avenue, we are changing the incentives of the companies themselves. MNCs on our side of the house will actively look, no thank you, for the cleanest of the subcontractors, so that they have as little chance as possible of being caught up in a human rights abuse scandal and having to pay these enormous fines. So we think that local businesses have an incentive to better the working conditions of their workers. We don't think that this is actually as costly, right? We think that making these like basic measures to ensure worker safety, for example, is capable. And we think that it's likely that MNCs themselves are going to pay bigger sums to their subcontractors just to ensure that all of these things are being fulfilled. So that's an incentive for businesses to change the working conditions. Secondly, governments are going to be lobbied by MNCs, right? It's likely that MNCs are just going to tell governments, look, we really need you not to abuse your workers anymore because otherwise we're in big trouble. So governments now, even corrupt governments across the developing world that are dependent on these MNCs, have an incentive to, one, better regulations when it comes to the sorts of rights that workers have, and secondly, enforce existing regulation. In many places, we indeed do have regulation, but it's not properly enforced by governments because they don't have an active incentive to do that. Because MNCs will actively be asking for that, they are now likelier to do it. Third avenue for change, there's going to be competition among states. If one country decides, I'm not going to change my regulations, then it's likely that the MNCs will just move to another developing country that has low cost of production and will but has better regulations. So this is an active incentive for governments to ensure that they're gonna just better the working conditions across the board. What is the impact here? We think that we get better working conditions in general for these developing countries, even for those local companies that are not currently being subcontracted by MNCs, but want to be subcontracted in the future. They're likelier to better their working conditions. For all of these reasons, we think that you should vote proposition.
I thank the second speaker of the proposition and invite the second opposition speaker. Here.
Hi, just a second. Okay, am I audible? I think Prop 2 has already dropped the debate when they really make a characterization that nothing changes through their side. Let's be very clear about the reason for why labor is cheap in the status quo and why companies would go to a different continent just because of labor, right? The reason for why a company in the United States will go all across the world, no matter how expensive transportation is, no matter how expensive it is for them to have to move back their products from that country into their homes, is because in the majority of cases the labor is so cheap in these places that it is worth happening. If side proposition is literally saying that is the only mechanism that's going to go down, then I think these companies are unlikely to go into these spaces. I think they have given you no reasons or realistic mechanisms for why is it likely that they are still going to go to China or Bangladesh in their best case scenario. Obviously, this is taking them at their best. I think in reality, they will just continue to go, but you don't get the benefits that they claim, right? I think in either side they lose, and I'm going to make it extremely clear throughout my speech. But I want to clarify two things before anything. The first is that they don't really engage with any of the counterfactuals that we give, the reason on how you push governments to be more hold accountable much more in these instances. And I think that most of the mechanisms that they talk about already exist. That's to say, if companies gain political capital, for example, from being branded as a good company that's creating ethical products, then I think the whole mediatic pressure that they talk about is still existent on the status quo. No, thank you. And I think specifically what we have to note is that in the counterfactual, there's already been a rise in general on the labor standards that exist. The second thing is, I think we have to be very clear on a labor and on an actor analysis, right? The companies who will change and the companies who won't. Those companies who can absorb the fines and continue to do so, the companies who already absorb millions of dollars of fines, such as Amazon, and that don't care about these types of things and continue to do so. I have 5 responses to their mechanism. The first is, how will these companies react when in the status quo, in many cases, they just absorb these types of fines? The fact of the matter is, I don't think they have the capital of saying that this would necessarily always happen. I think the reason for it was very hard to increase by $15 the minimum wage in the United States with a company that was acting in the United States is because you don't normally have the capital of doing these types of things. I think that no politician really has the incentive of putting very hard fines for the companies of their own country for the impacts that they are creating in Bangladesh. So as far as of course they can fiat that this fines will exist, they cannot really fiat that they will be strong enough so as to disincentivize these countries. I think insofar as it is already completely proven that politicians don't have the incentive of affecting the companies from their own countries, I think this is an issue. The second thing that we say is, why is it only in the West? I don't know if they misspoke when they were explaining it, but they dropped this attack that we gave in first. What happens if it's a Mexican company, a transnational company, who's bringing products into the United States? Those companies would not be regulated under the very bad model. If you want to clarify this part, I would highly encourage you to do so right now. Cool. The third response that I have is that in many cases, you would have to be entering the jurisdiction of other countries. That's to say, I think it is more likely for companies to, in many cases, in the best scenarios of prop, lobby so that these laws are changed. I think that is worse insofar as now these privates have more power entering into these countries. Fourth response is, we think in many countries, in many scenarios, these countries love the multinationals, and that doesn't only extend to the analysis that I've given on how they are likely to hold them accountable, but to the extent that in many cases, the ones who are the most powerful are going to be the ones given the least types of these fines, even if those fines do exist. Responses for their first argument. I think it is not true that all these companies are complicit with these processes. They don't engage with Maria's first argument, in which we say in many instances, they literally don't know about this. I want to give a very clear example. In Mexico, for example, the very big the very big market for avocados and other types of crops, which is one of the biggest multinational enterprises from Mexico to the United States and Canada. In many cases, those enterprises are taken by literally like the cartels. And in those instances, companies with genuinely honest people who are creating jobs for many, many people in Mexico, in the US and Canada for transportation, do not know that the abuses are happening because those companies are having to allow for certain abuses to exist. I think that is a big problem. But then they say, and this is the hardest, the biggest mechanism that they make, the thing is now there will be contracts, right? I think right now contracts don't look like you are allowed to like enslave individuals. Obviously the contracts in the status quo already say you cannot enslave people, but this company is never following them. So really they have no way of ensuring that this will happen. Second response is we think they still want cheap labor. Insofar as that happens, they have very little incentives. And I think it is cheaper for you to continue to have the very cheap labor in Bangladesh and simultaneously paying the fines, because literally all your products are cheaper, even if you have to pay this. I think that was an issue. But obviously, let's engage with what happens if the fines are massively big. I think what then will happen is that they will just stay in the country. As first said, staying in the United States. I think insofar as these countries already depend on the labor, that's literally the millions of people in Bangladesh, in Mexico, in China, who literally just work on creating these textiles are literally gone on their global pandemic. Third and last response, they are abandoning many people who would otherwise have no opportunities. They say that MNCs will now look for the cleanest of subcontractors. The first response that we have is that in our site, you can still make them cleaner holistically. That's to say, we push these countries and we push these governments into having to have structural regulations and analysis so that it is better. And when they say now there will be a competition between governments, I think it is more likely for them to just choose particular countries and just like buy those benefits on their side. I want to give a couple of things on re-strengthening because they really didn't respond to the majority of our case.
Sure.
I think the reason why the scapegoat exists, no thank you, is because there are less incentives to strengthen local law. And the mechanism for this is because now people are systematically underemployed. That is, if you, like, for example, are being given so hard fines that you will now not have the incentive of going into these countries because you know that no matter what they do, Bangladesh will still have very bad working conditions, which is to say, no matter what you do, these countries will still have this problem. If you want it to be cheap, right, because they want both things, then I think that is a problem. So what's the comparative? If they still want this to be cheap, they necessarily have to have certain degree of abuse. Therefore, I think it is more likely for these companies to stay home. And in far as that is the case, I'll take in a second. What is most likely is that these countries have even worse laws because in underemployment, they need for other like local companies within their countries to exist, even if they are not multinational, so that there's more jobs. That's to say, for example, a Bangladeshi, like less regulations for a Bangladeshi company, which is not multinational, but that now will continue to create the same problems. Before I move into our third argument, sure.
The thing you're missing is that if I pay $2 to someone in Bangladesh, that is going to ensure them food for the next week. And it also means that I don't need to have any human rights abuses. This is enough for them. And it's still cheaper than producing in the US.
So I think, therefore, the clash in the debate is whether or not you believe that these abuses will still happen in Bangladesh. I think they will continue to happen because these countries structurally don't have the laws and don't have the structures to actually change, right? Insofar as that's the case, therefore, now the companies that you talk about don't have an incentive of going to Bangladesh and ensuring that the person has something to eat. They will just produce in countries like, I don't know, in Mexico, which is closer, or home in the United States, as you yourself said. I want to tell you a third argument on how under a capitalist system where radical change is the means of production is hard, we think branding and consumption are some of the only alternatives for making decisions within the system. The first line here is that at least we can differentiate, companies can differentiate one from one another, gaining capital from making the supply chain as good as possible. That's to say now companies are framing themselves as ethical consumption. This is airlines who in 2018 donated significant amounts of their revenue into looking for renewable resources, or brands who are trying to put ethical stamps on their products. On our side, at least you have the principal desire for people to have agency on choosing between different options. But this reason, what doesn't happen on prop, and this is the most important mechanism in the argument, is that they now structurally like attack companies who don't consent over the abuses that are happening. This is to say, companies who literally don't know that the abuses are happening, and where now the law is saying, no matter what you do, you are bad. When do you do this? You don't have the ability of showing I am good, but this company isn't, and I want to differentiate myself by having actual benefits that others can't. The same is true with media attention. So media attention can still happen on our side, as they say, and protect these individuals. We are proud to oppose.
I thank the second speaker of the opposition and invite the third speaker of the proposition.
Can you guys hear me? Is it fine? Okay. In 2012, Apple subcontracted the production of their newest iPad to some Chinese company. Their factories didn't have any safety regulations. People slept in the facility next to the factory. And when four factories inevitably burned down, there was no improvement, and they burned down from a very simple reason. There was just improper ventilation. People couldn't breathe there, and the aluminum dust wasn't getting out. We're telling you that it doesn't cost a lot for these companies to stop doing human rights abuses. It generally just putting ventilation so the factory doesn't burn down. It's not working them for 16 hours a day and imposing that people actually work for a decent amount of time. For all the whataboutism that side opposition wants to do, we're still unsure how they're changing anything on their side, and we're still unsure how a factory, a company not knowing is enough to not hold them morally accountable. So what we're going to do is that what I'm going to do is I'll first talk about whether or not companies are morally accountable, and secondly, on how we're protecting human rights better. So first point, are companies morally accountable? We gave you systemic reasons why these companies are. First of all, that they're a direct complice, because what they're doing is that they're basically forcing subcontractors into accepting doing human rights abuses for the sake of profit. What does this look like? Apple goes to that Chinese company and says, I'm going to pay you X amount of money. I don't care if you can do that without human rights abuses or not. This is what I'm paying. So now the subcontractor is basically forced to do human rights abuses in order to make a profit, because otherwise Apple is not going to pay them anymore, and is going to go to some other company that will do human rights abuses for the sake of those prices. So we're telling you that they are a direct accomplice specifically because they impose this on smaller companies. So telling side opposition telling us that I don't know about the workers, first of all, that's untrue. They are the ones that are forcing subcontractors into doing this. And second of all, that's not really a moral justification for doing this, right? That doesn't mean they should not be they should not be held morally accountable. Because if I tell a hungry person, I will give you $1 million to hurt someone else, that means I'm still an accomplice. That means I'm still liable for the thing I did, whether or not I know if the person actually hurt the person I was talking about or not. Before I move on, sure.
If it's so cheap to create this change, why aren't companies doing it in the status quo? Or do you think that Apple, Nestle, and Unilever are systematically so evil that they just like watching people suffer?
First of all, we might believe they're evil. This doesn't really matter into the debate. We're telling you that it's cheaper to not do it, but it wouldn't cost them a lot if they did. It would cost more if they want to maximize profits. They do make human rights abuses, but we're telling you that it doesn't take a lot of money to change that. Moreover, it will take less money than being fined all the time, but I'll get to that later. Now, the second point in this entire clash of our companies morally accountable, we told you that companies are making a profit out of this. And this means that they should know about how they're making their profit. So saying, oh, they didn't know, it's not an excuse. They should know how their profits are being made, which means they should have safeguards. They should have people in the factory seeing if the things are being respected. As long as you're making a profit, you should be held accountable. What companies are doing is that they're basically profiting from the fact that the governments don't have good enough regulations. And now the last thing I'll do in this clash point is I'll interact with the third argument that they just gave on the last speaker, which basically said that I can differentiate by being good. I can differentiate from other companies by being good and not having my reputation destroyed. We're telling you that, yes, what you should have done from the very get-go is go and ensure that there are no human rights abuses. If your reputation is destroyed, you probably deserve that as a company. We're telling you that on our side of the house, what we're doing is that we're forcing companies into actually making sure that human rights are respected inside all of their production chain, not only inside their main company. So morally, we believe that we have proven the debate. Now, let's see if we're actually protecting human rights or not. So what we talked, let's speak the language of money for a second, because side opposition doesn't really understand how these fines will work. If not doing human rights abuses would cost $1 million, but fines are $3 million, guess what? I'll stop doing human rights abuses so that I don't get fined. Note, we explained from the very get-go how the fines are getting progressively higher. So that means that at one point, the fines will be high enough that the cost of having human rights, the benefit I'm getting from having human rights abuses just doesn't pay for the fines, which means that at one point, because you keep getting fined, you will stop doing the human rights abuses. So how will they make that? They will pressure the subcontractors into respecting human rights abuses. They'll tell them, okay, we're going to pay you more, but stop doing human rights abuses. Or if the subcontractor doesn't want to do it, they will just choose a better subcontractor that will. This was our third argument that they didn't interact with. The fact that you force all companies inside the developing country to respect human rights because now they have a competitive advantage if they do. Because multinational companies come in and they tell them, look, I want you to respect human rights. I'm going to pay you big money if you do. This means that not only the company that is currently, not only the current subcontractor is going to have better conditions and is going to protect human rights, but all other companies that want to have a competitive advantage now respect human rights. This is a top-down approach, which basically means that because big companies want these things to be respected, the other smaller companies will conform. So the response we had here from side opposition was very weak. They essentially told us, but what about other companies that are not from the West? We told you that we're going to find them through Western authorities so that we don't have any, no thank you, we don't have any problems when it comes to these governments being too weak, and they're still non-comparative. At least on our side, the big companies like Nike, Adidas, H&M, or Apple are now respecting these guidelines that we're imposing, and they're forcing all of their subcontractors to respect it as well. And the other response we had here is that companies absorb the fines and they're not big enough. We already explained how the fines are getting progressively higher, so you can't just absorb the fines, but we also explained on the second speaker how just absorbing the fines will probably lead to a huge PR disaster the moment that world governments are fighting against you. So that means that companies will be incentivized to pay the fines. And this basically proves that it's more likely to protect human rights on our side. But what did they provide on this point? First of all, they told us that we can target the issues locally. Let's be real, guys, because there's no incentive for the governments on your side of the house to do anything about it, which means that they don't have any mechanism for change. For all their talk about how, oh, you're not protecting human rights, neither are they. They're being very uncomparative. So taking them at their best, they're still not solving the issue. It's more likely that human rights will be respected on our side. But they also had a point about how people are losing jobs. We already addressed this. The working conditions there don't have to be abusive to be cheap. We're telling you that these people are still going to be cheaper than producing in Western states. Even if you don't have human rights abuses, these companies will still go to Bangladesh, they will still go to developing countries, they'll just stop doing human rights abuses. But let's take them at their best. Let's say that these companies actually move out of developing countries. Compare this, Judge. The trade-off is that a lot of people aren't being abused anymore, but you lose a few jobs. We'll take that, and we'll take the debate as well.
I thank the third proposition speaker and invite the third opposition speaker for the last constructive speech in the debate. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Yes.
Yeah.
Would it be possible to not screen share the timer? It's difficult for me to like hear the POI, so I would rather for them to raise their hand, but I can't like look at two things at the same time. Would that be fine? Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the inconvenience.
No worries.
Two strategic flaws in the side of the proposition, and then 2 points of clash that will make it crystal clear why the side of the opposition has won this debate. First, on the principle of responsibility for harm, and second, on the rights of workers and on which side of the house these rights are respected to a greater extent. Let's talk about strategy. First, even though Manuel points out that their mechanism literally is only prosecuting these companies in the Western world, their entire mechanism and their entire benefits are only limited to companies that operate and have headquarters within the Western world. We believe that there are a plethora of multinational corporations within China and India where this would be legally impossible for them to be prosecuted. The reason why you should care about this is because our counterfactual does target the entirety of multinational companies, and I will prove why our counterfactual is better than the solution that they bring. But the second reason is they never prove to you why a government will target companies that put money directly into their pockets. But now let's move into the first point of clash on the principle of responsibility for harm. Essentially, proposition tells us these companies are directly responsible for the harm that they are doing, and therefore they should be held accountable. I still believe that this is a principle based on practical impact, because if you take this principle to the fullest extent, the only way to fulfill it is for there to be some kind of retribution, some kind of like reparations paid for these victims, and therefore that already doesn't fall within the principal scope of this debate. Under our side, we ask ourselves, who is actually accountable, who is actually responsible for all this harm? And note that if I prove to you that companies are less accountable than governments under the status quo, much of their content is already framed out of this debate. So why is this true? No, thank you. I believe that companies want to enter the government necessarily have to sell at market price, because if they sell higher, literally they won't get enough demand for them to make a sufficient profit to survive. This entails having low costs of production, especially cheap labor, which is basically what this debate is about. But once they enter the market, in order to stay in that market and to keep on making this revenue, they mustn't increase their cost of production, because once again, they will literally just be priced out. I think companies serve two roles in the status quo. The first one is of maximizing profits, and the second one is of generating jobs. The only way for these companies to survive in the market is to do these sorts of things. Under that premise, I don't believe that these companies fully consent to doing these harms. But two other reasons. In their mechanism, they say that they would incur substantial fines to all these individuals, meaning that the minimum would be a very high one. I think it is unfair for companies to be grouped as evil, to be grouped as equally harming individuals, when they can range from just having extremely long hours to literally child labor. We believe that the harm is extremely different.
Ma'am.
But the second thing that we characterize, please stop barricading, is that the supply chain is so large, going again across so many countries and incurring so many activities, that we think it is literally impossible for companies to know absolutely all the harms that undergo. To that extent, I don't believe that they consent to the harm that they're doing. But now let's talk about the government. I believe on a very social contract basis, the government in these developing countries has a direct role of protecting the rights of citizens. We believe that they have a higher responsibility than companies of doing this, because that is literally their purpose, whereas companies are profit maximizers, companies create jobs. The status quo is one where the government is failing failing by creating lackluster labor laws, by having weak economies where their citizens don't have enough jobs, where they are literally corrupt and they receive bribes from these multinational corporations in order to continue to do these sorts of things, where they literally use the military to recruit individuals to go to these factories. This is something that has historically happened and continues to happen. We believe that the liability should fall to them. Under their set of the House, neither legally nor optically does this happen. I believe that this already frames much of their content out of this debate. Before I move on to the second point to go.
So you're trying to explain how these companies, how these governments are extremely corrupt, how they're extremely mischievous, and at the same time, they are the ones that are supposed to make the legislation and impose the benefits on your side of the House?
Look, I will prove to you in this point of clash why I do believe that that is more likely to happen under our side of the House, and I'll make sure to flag it. So on proposition, they basically have three mechanisms. The first one is that they're going to create like these contracts where these types of things are no longer legal. As Manuel told you, I don't believe that this is explicit in the contract anyways. But the second thing that they give you, and like the stronger deterrent under their side of the House, is that these companies are likely to opt out of human rights abuses simply because they have a profit incentive to do this. A few responses. First, I believe that some companies can literally afford to do this, and therefore they will continue to do so, something that they concede under their side of the House, so already their impact is minimal. The second thing I would say is that I believe that these companies are unlikely to be prosecuted in the first place, or for this prosecution and for these fines to be strong enough because of two reasons that weren't engaged with. The first one is because these companies have very strong ties with the government, because they literally like give money for politicians to get into the positions that they have, or because they literally contribute to the economic growth of the country and therefore contribute to like the image of these politicians as a country that is prosperous.
Point of information.
The second thing that we told you is that like bureaucratically, we also think that this is like very difficult. But the third thing that we would say is that for the countries that can't afford for these types of like fines and that will be deterred from entering these countries, we believe that the harm is humongous. We believe that they still have a competitive like incentive to look for cheap labor. They just have an incentive to do it in a way that is more secretive, to do this in a way that is even less transparent. The reason why I believe they will exit these countries is because they don't really prove to us why under their side of the House it is likely for these government regulations to change. I think government regulations will get worse under their side of the House, because in the moment when there's like multinational company flight from these developing countries, then there will be a crisis of underemployment. I believe this is an incentive for local companies to further abuse citizens there, precisely because there's a huge supply of workers, and therefore to maximize profits, companies can and will do this. We believe that the fact that their response is like, hey, putting little like ventilators doesn't cost, literally contradicts their entire characterization of the magnitude of this problem in the first place. They talk about these local companies competing with international companies. I think they're literally different markets. But why is it harmful that they exit these countries? I think that like they are likely to do this because the cost of like the political and economic capital that they lose by being charged for these human rights abuses is larger than like the greater costs of production that they would incur within their own country by having labor within that own country. I believe that the impact of this is massive job loss in these developing countries where they literally have no alternative, and also there's a lesser incentive for quality checks to actually go to these developing countries because there's the idea that like this problem has already been solved. What is our counterfactual, and why do we believe that this is something that is getting better and is like to some extent self-regulatory? First, we talked to you about consumer pressure. We talked to you about how in the status quo, companies have incentives to be ethical, precisely because consumers can like choose different companies that are more ethical in the status quo. We believe that this looks like H&M getting better subcontractors or things like that. The second thing we told you is that we do believe that there's an opportunity cost in this debate, where under their side of the House, there's a scapegoat where these companies are exclusively blamed for these sorts of issues, and therefore there's no longer investigation towards developing countries. There are no longer boycotts, and there's no longer media attention. To that extent, I believe that the rights of these individuals are in a worse position, and the principle also falls to our side is so proud to oppose.
I thank the third speaker of the opposition and invite the opposition reply. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Cool. Prop makes two strategic mistakes by which they cannot win this debate in no way, shape, or form. The first is they completely dropped their mechanism throughout the last two speeches. That is to say, although we tell them many of the companies that you talk about will still continue to do so, and now under less regulation, because you literally have more of a supply of jobs than we think is a problem. We literally told you in many instances, it is very hard for you to have as big fines as they talk about, because these politicians don't have the incentive of fining corporations that literally have a trickle-down effect in the United States. That is why even when like Amazon was affecting people in the United States, it was very hard to find Amazon. I think that is way more less likely when the people who are being affected are random Bangladeshi individuals. No response at all. We told you in many instances these types of problems will continue to exist, because if these companies like have a contract and that subcontractor just breaks the contract, the problem continues to exist. And now you would find them unfairly even when they tried. No response at all. We told you in many instances what ends up happening is that these corporations, such as Chinese multinational corporations, which literally can be trialed, will now be able to exploit much more, because now there is no incentive of changing laws, and that is way worse. The second thing that I want to highlight is they really haven't proved to you that more benefits exist than harms on their side. And the role in this debate is not necessarily where do you have better regulation, but the question in this debate is whether or not the things that they are doing creates more harms or more benefits. Therefore, you can hold us accountable to the counterfactual. But the reality in this debate is we prove to you that there are more problems when you choose their side than when you do literally anything else. 2 points of clash on responsibility and on changes. The first thing that they never engaged with in this debate is what happens when these groups are not guilty. The response that they gave is, no, but they are. We think they are two groups of corporations that are not guilty in any way, shape, or form in many instances. First is the corporations who literally just don't know that the abuses are happening. These are corporations whose subcontractor just broke the contract. I told you in second op how in the status quo, the contracts don't look like you are allowed to kill individuals. It already says we will only hire you if you are decent enough because we want political capital. But they break that. And the reason why these multinational companies don't hold the subcontractors accountable is because it's cheap labor that it still exists on side proposition. The second group is those who literally can't do anything about it, right? Who have the alternative of just leaving. These are, for example, in the avocado or in the crops industry in Asia and in Latin America, where the reason for abuse happens is because of local bosses or local external forces, such as the cartels. I think in those instances, it is unfair to penalize them with millions of dollars if they literally had nothing to do. They had to engage with that. But we did engage with what happened when these are companies who literally are like basically giving money for blood. I will explain how we win that actor in the second point of clash. But two other points on the principle of responsibility in this debate. The first is we talked about in second op how this the US government has no jurisdiction or principal responsibility to find companies where it's happening in Bangladesh if in Bangladesh they are allowing for this to happen. No response at all again. We say that the government has a historic responsibility because it was the Bangladeshi, the Filipino, the Indonesian, the Chinese, or the Mexican government who literally said you are allowed to exploit my workers, therefore they have a responsibility to act. Even if they don't, the principle is not contingent on change. No response. It is impressive how they didn't care about our case. Second point of clash on changes. We talked about on both sides how consumers can boycott and how there can be media attention. Why do we therefore win that on our side? Because we say that when it is successful, what you have is structural change, meaning that the changes that exist through pressure happen to law and not just to a particular company who will change, right? And we think that that was a point that was important. We say that these companies are likely to leave these countries. And the reason why it is like this is worse off on prop, even if you get no regulation on our side, is one, because literally, people have no jobs. I think it's better for you to have unregulated workforce than to have no workforce. That is, Bangladeshi people would prefer to have bad jobs than no jobs at all. And the second thing, which is why it is worse, is because now the type of exploitation that you can have in other areas, such as by Chinese, Indian, Singaporean, Mexican companies who literally are framed out of their model, is way worse when you have no incentive of creating those changes. Side prop conceded this debate. We are proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition reply, and I invite the proposition reply to conclude this debate. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Okay, great. One sec. Okay, panel, picture this. You're Tim Cook, and Apple is being fined a couple of $1 million a month because one subcontractor that you have in Bangladesh offers no fire safety protocols for their factories, no ventilators, and pays workers $0.5 per day. You have essentially three options. One, sit there and see your revenues being slowly but surely eaten up for no reason. B, move your production back into the US, where workers are unionized, fire safety protocols are even harder to meet, where there's a $7.5 minimum wage. Or C, give your subcontractor a couple of $100,000, tell them, please put some ventilators, put the fire safety protocol in place, and pay your workers a little bit more. We think on side proposition that it's very easy for you to just pick C, because this is what makes the most sense after a rational calculus. Three main points in my reply speech. One, a bit of clarification. Two, on principle. Three, on practicalities. A bit of clarifications. A lot of the content of team opposition in today's debate goes along two lines. First, governments in developing countries are doing bad. Agreed. Two, local companies in developing countries are doing bad. Agreed. Now what? Because they don't provide any sort of real tangible mechanism through which these actors can be held accountable, through which they have an incentive to change their ways. But they do provide a counterfactual, consumer pressure. But then it doesn't really seem to be working, is it? Right? Consumer pressure exists, and presumably a lot of these abuses shouldn't happen in the first place, but they do. So we need something else. This is what we're proposing on our side of the house. Oh, and one more thing, right? Their idea that somehow, oh, you're not talking about companies in Mexico and in China. Look, even if our impacts only apply to Western companies, on the comparative, we still have hundreds of thousands of workers who are living decent lives. They don't have that. We still win, even on just on Western companies. First, on principle. Look, our principle was that if you're actively complicit in human rights abuse, you should be held accountable for that. Not that, of course, you should also stop that, but the principle was that we shouldn't turn a blind eye on the companies that are actively funneling money into human rights abuses, right? So it's not contingent on pragmatics. The only real challenge that they gave to our principle was, oh, but these mom and pop shops, right? Apple, H&M, they just don't know. There's no way they could know. First, if they really don't know, then that's a problem. They should have had inspectors looking at all of the factories where they're getting their profits from, right? You don't just give a free pass to your subcontractors and they have all of their resources to put these checks into place, panel. Let's not kid ourselves. But secondly, we pretty clearly explained to you that in many instances, they actively tell these subcontractors, look, I'm only paying you this. You do whatever you want. I'm not going to investigate you. I'm not going to have any inspections. Just give me the profits, right? So there's a clear win for team proposition on principle. Second, on practicalities. Look, we've already seen hefty fines implemented against companies in the status quo. The European Commission has done that. We think that it's likely we're going to have some fines on our side of the house as well. Two, we think that for the vast majority of corporations, again, it just makes more economic sense to stay in these countries that offer them like these very, very lax labor laws, that offer them these very cheap labor force, even if they have to pay them $1 more per day. We think that it's perfectly fine for them to do that. And three, we think that we've also explained to you how actual change in the legislation of these countries that they so much want on their side of the house is likelier on our side of the house when there are structural incentives for these companies to act, for these countries to actually change these laws because they're lobbied by MNCs. So for all of these reasons, we think that proposition has won today's debate.
I thank the proposition reply, and I thank you all for this fine debate. I'd like to ask you to cross the floor and shake hands, but this is impossible on the internet. So I'm just going to ask the org.com to move you out of this room, and we're going to try to be as brief as possible and have a decision and to do the feedback and everything as fast as possible.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.